to introduce this little discussion about little magazines. A long time ago, around the time of Vitruvius, it took a treatise to talk about architecture. Then, in the Renaissance, it took a lot of treatises to talk about architecture. And then, around the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, it took manifestos to talk about architecture. And then, as Beatrice Colomina and all her group demonstrated in Pip-Stamp Poll, by the 1940s, it took magazines and journals and little magazines and big journals to talk about architecture. And now, it takes teeny little journals to talk about architecture, and they're called Log and Blog and another pamphlet and all those other things. And I'm extremely pleased tonight to hand over the proceedings to Cynthia Davison, who has been from Chicago, one of the best critics of architecture, coming to New York, masterminding the extraordinarily complicated 10-year saga of ENI all over the world, and then coming down to a micro scale, which now becomes a macro scale because all over the world everyone reads Blog. And now, in the future, everyone will read Blog, another magazine, and Pigeon. So, Cynthia.
I like how you sat on stage. That was good. Can you guys hear us? No. Or do we have to have microphones recording? No, we'll go sit up there so you can see us. All right, let's go up there. Okay, so people have phones on there. I didn't know that. How are we doing? I'm not standing up.
You're just on the other ear.
These on? They are. That's good. I'm Cynthia Davidson. I have been an editor and writer about architecture for almost 30 years. It's gone by pretty quickly. But since I'm not sure anybody here is 30 years old, I feel a little bit like a mother hen. It's not a role I want to play because neither did I give birth to these projects nor nurture these projects. Neither did I organize. A lot of disclaimers here. I did not organize this evening. I know what these journals are because one has to always be mindful of the competition. They are competition for Log. They are competition for Architectural Record. They are competition for Domus, for San Rocco, AA Files, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're all in competition together, not just for readers. I have to assume because you're here, you are readers or aspiring writers. And we are in competition for writers. So if there are aspiring writers here, you can come and see me first, afterward. We're all, however, going to be friendly tonight, right? Because we're all in the same game. We all have the same interest, and that is in publication. I find this timing fortuitous. Jacob, maybe you knew this was happening, but as you probably all know, Archizines, the show that originated at the AA last fall, is opening at Storefront on Tuesday night. All 4 magazines associated here at the table are in Archizines, while we are a little bit representative of what goes on in the New York scene in terms of publication, particularly publication that's coming from architects. Once you see Archizine, you realize what a sort of broad spread phenomenon it is today. but in a very different way, I think, than the magazines Tony referred to when he mentioned clip, stamp, fold. I was given an agenda, questions to talk about, which I'm going to veer from a little bit. There were why here and now, why print, and to what end. I don't know, as we go around here, if each team is going to address these questions in their very brief overview of what it is they're trying to do. But I would like you all to be thinking that instead of asking why here and now, why at all, and why writing, and instead of under why print, what has desktop publishing introduced? Does that have a role in why we're making magazines? And to what end? The first question there was the intended audience, and I would say, but is it for an audience or is it for oneself? Why does one start a magazine? I'm not convinced one starts a magazine because one anticipates there's an audience. Instead, that there's something in you that needs to be developed as some sort of publication that can then be disseminated and the audience finds itself. So just to throw out some of those ideas, get them floating in the air, we will go alphabetically so that we aren't just going around chronologically. Chronologically, I think Pigeon's the oldest. So, but alphabetically, we go another pamphlet, clog, and Pigeon. So I bring you the three gentlemen from another pamphlet who are in the middle, who I just met. One's Ryan, one's John Carlo, and the other one, I'm sorry, I don't remember. But he has glasses. So go ahead, guys.
Thanks for the introduction. Is this on? Or are we gonna?
Yeah, somebody has to, but
I'll do it. Oh, do you mind, Jackie? I'll put this in.
See, this is good.
Yeah.
I've created havoc in the
Yes. Gotta be quick enough. I can try and click it for you. Okay, our publication is called Another Pamphlet. This is it. This is what it looks like. Next slide. Another Pamphlet is both more of the same and something different. The name Another is pretty important to us. We started the pamphlet out of a real appreciation for writing, out of a real appreciation for architecture writing, but we also started it out of a desire to do something new. And so the title itself has contained within it, but the seeds of both continuity and change. You can go to the next one. Another Pamphlet is a conversation. Above all, really it's just, we started as an opportunity for the three of us, Giancarlo, Isaiah, and I, to get together and have an excuse to talk about ideas that were interesting to us. So it was an excuse to hang out, and it really became just a document of shared excitement to begin with. And an excuse to reach out and try and have a conversation, not just amongst ourselves, but then amongst a next ring of friends, and then as an excuse to reach out and approach people that we wanted to have a conversation with. Another Pamphlet is deliberately short. We're all busy. This is very much a project in support of other projects. It's not the only thing we're doing. We're all super busy, and we know that the people that we want to get involved in the conversation are also super busy, and so it was really important to us to have something that was sort of agile enough to support all the other activities that we were doing. Each contribution is just 300 words and one image. So we set very specific criteria that hopefully allow it to be a sort of easy thing to participate in. Another pamphlet is perversely anachronistic. It's printed on paper and distributed via the post. we print them ourselves, we fold them ourselves, we staple them ourselves, we send them out. It's pretty important to us that this is a physical object, something to hold, to tuck in our back pocket, and then to even throw away. And against, in comparison to the sort of haze of digital distraction of all the sort of blogs and proliferating media sources, it was really pretty important to us to have something that actually held our attention because of its physicality, and that in some ways it actually had a lifespan as well, and that we could actually lose it, or it could degrade. This is really important. Another pamphlet is a group effort. Each issue, we set a theme, we pick the issue that we want to talk about, we sort of frame it. We, as we like to say, we set the table, we invite the people who are going to be involved in the conversation. And then we sort of step away a little bit. We have a very light editorial hand, and we really sort of see what happens, see what comes out of that conversation. The whole endeavor is organized around the group, around the sort of contingent collective that develops, around the people that we've invited, and we try and really emphasize that group instead of the individual positions that might be staked in the pamphlet. And another pamphlet is an experiment. It's an ongoing experiment. It's an ongoing project. It continues to evolve. We have 3 issues. We're working on our 4th right now. In the 3rd issue, we sort of introduced this mutation to it, where we sort of self-critiqued our form of conversation. We set out this way of expanding the conversation. We can talk more about that. But really, it's meant to be a vehicle for us to kick around ideas, and as such, we want it to be loose enough to be able to change as our ideas change, as the form of our thinking changes. So, stay tuned.
So we're next.
All right, so my name is Cal May. I'm the editor-in-chief of CLOG. I'm going to introduce our staff real quick because we've grown substantially. So it started off with myself and Julia Vondenhout, who's sitting over here, and then it grew to be Jacob Rydell, Archie Lee Coates, Jeffrey Franklin, and Human Wu, who's in Basel. And we have 3 new members, Carlos Velez, Margaret O'Connor, and Nancy Lind, who are in the audience as well. So CLOG started as basically looking at the way we get our information these days, which isn't how it used to be. These days when we go to find out what's happening in architecture, we go and we log on to architecture blogs, and that's where we get our information from. So every day, some of these blogs publish 9 posts a day. You can just keep going, which is 45 posts a week, which is 270 posts a month, which is 3,200 posts a year, and CLOG formed in order to slow things down, to actually make a space that we could discuss singular topics that we felt were important to architecture right now, holistically and from multiple points of view. So that's what CLOG is about, and we're actually the youngest of the 4 journals that are here today.
So you can't control this and do this at the same time?
Yeah.
All right, cool. So just going to take you really quickly through the topics we've done so far. So the first issue was about BIG. Most of you in the audience probably know, but if you don't, it's a kind of emerging in America architectural firm that's had a kind of spectacular success recently. The next issue was about Apple. Again, kind of a company that we identified that really produces an enormous amount of architecture, and remarkably to us, that work hadn't gone discussed among architects in particular. The issue we're working on right now is about data centers. We're investigating really the physical manifestation of the cloud, and that'll be coming out in May. And then the issue then following that will be about renderings, and we're working on that.
We're actually receiving submissions up until today. So the important thing about these topics, and people often ask us how we pick topics, we have a lot of editors, is that we duke it out internally, but we do come to a consensus, and we really want the topics to be, first of all, about architecture, but also fundamentally accessible and interesting to a much wider readership. And that kind of plays into a fundamental idea or belief we have, which is that, in a way, CLOG for us is, gateway drug to architecture, ideally, and really is about accessibility. And Julia, I think.
And to create this holistic and accessible dialogue, we encourage anybody to submit. We have open submissions, and contributions can be either text or graphics, because we really want to show the wide range that critique can take. Our texts are limited to 500 words because we want each to have a concise and clear point of view, and we believe that can be done in 500 words. And that overall collection of topics then contributes to this holistic and wide conversation. And with all these different points of view, our voice as the editors comes through in the way we curate the pieces, how we lay them out, and how we edit them and collect them.
The challenge with the design of the issue has always been to promote content over the brand of the journal itself. So, for instance, a lot of journals in the actual cover of the issue emphasizes the brand of the journal more than it emphasizes the content. So we simply wanted to reverse that, and then all the way down to the layout of the issue itself. We wanted to maximize the content. So on the right spread, there's always text. We've minimized the margins to allow for a maximum amount of content. And then on the left side is to actually pull out a quote and to focus on content. So the author's name and the author's title is always diminished. And then it also sort of allows for 2 speeds of reading as you're going through it. You can kind of skim on the left and dive deep on the right.
Go ahead.
Okay, we're gonna go back, have a reversed order here. In our opinion, the whole idea of CLOG starts with the journal, but it kind of continues outside of the physical publication, and it becomes kind of accessible to even a wider audience by these events that we are trying to put on, and that's really where we see CLOG going in the future, is more towards kind of these events. Pigeon?
Okay. So that's Mark McQuaid manning the computer. I'm Brian Tables and Alec Buick. Besides being, I guess, the oldest young journal here, I think we also, Pigeon had a couple of unique things as opposed to what's going on with the other people at the table, but one is that tonight Mark and I are kind of here as 2 of the founding editors of the project, and Alec is here as a current editor, and so we're just going to talk about a little bit the origins of Pigeon and how it got started, and then Alec's going to talk about where it could be going. So one of the big differences, I think, between Pigeon and the other journals is that we came out of an institutional context that the kind of demands for clarity in terms of something like a theme or these demand for a certain strict guideline as to what the content could be weren't a burden we really had to deal with, because we were at a place where content was kind of constantly being generated. And the urgency for us was to really get that kind of a slice through that content outside of Princeton, which at the time was feeling a little claustrophobic, I think. And we felt like there was a lot of exciting things going on that nobody was getting to see. I think the other thing that was driving us was that there was a really diverse group of people at the school, and it was a kind of an opportunity to have a common link that we were all in architecture school, but the journal itself didn't have to have, again, the sort of burden of being super focused on anything. And in fact, really the one rule that we made was that there was no portfolio pieces at the beginning. And it was kind of about everything except for the sort of dry, conventional presentation of work. And then I guess the last thing I would say, I'm sure we're going to get into a lot of other topics, but is that another thing that we explored in terms of, it was definitely an indulgence for the first editors to produce a graphic object and something that kind of more than people, our colleagues and professors at the school would see. At the same time, there's a kind of history of journals at Princeton that have started there, and then the editors sort of took them along with them, which was one reason why there wasn't a sort of student journal at the time. And so Stan was really sort of generous with us to Stan Allen, the dean at the time, and currently I guess for a little bit longer, really generous to let us just kind of, he was very supportive about the project and just kind of let us do this sort of messy thing that we wanted to do. And we, as editors, when we were leaving, always wanted to kind of let students coming in later to continue the experimentation and to continue to develop the cross-section through the school at their time that they were there. So we really kind of handed it off to the future editors, which is a good position to maybe pass it to where things are coming out.
Thanks. So I said before the lecture that I was sort of unintentionally going to present the end of a game of telephone. That's about 5 years after the initial push for Pigeon, and we're still going through the first issue, I guess. But a lot of the things Brian said are exactly the same now. This is issue 12, and I would say, in my interpretation, again, a couple of generations removed in a way, Pigeon is very much a place for sort of documentation and stories about architecture, like others have been saying. It can take all sorts of forms, so written and visual. But I think we always like to think that it's, I think, opposed to the other journals, and perhaps because of the sort of institutional privilege we've been granted or have inherited in my case, we can tell stories that might not get told otherwise. So this last piece was a great sort of travelogue of a classmate of ours who went and looked at two master plans in Kazakhstan. And the sort of improvisatory nature of it, I think, is really important. And last, I guess, along those lines, at least my understanding of the title was kind of a huge reason I kind of went to Princeton in a way, because I thought it was just, in terms of everyone here, I think, is developing a sort of pidgin or a sort of improvised language as to how to talk about these things.
I think just one other slight thing, which is that I think also for both Brian and I and Caroline, the other original editor, it also came this is sort of 6 years ago, which is different than now, but it also very much came out of, for me, like a real frustration with particularly American architectural magazines and journals at the time. And to some extent still today, but it's changed a lot, obviously, in the 6 years. Not just for the people at the new journals at the table, but also more mainstream journals. And and really trying to counter that, both on like a mainstream journal side with things like Architectural Record, as we saw in Image before, and those kind of mainstream American journals, but also in the context of Princeton Graduate School, also things like Perspecta and being coming out of a university. And I think, as Brian said, not being the kind of standard advertisement for the school that was really about a kind of portfolio of like renderings or the standard portfolio projects, but trying to capture all the other interesting work there. And also just a huge frustration of architects who care so much about materiality and building and constructing things, and the magazines are assembled like crap and have no real love of materiality and objecthood. Something like Architectural Record serves as a great purpose, but it also is a really, in my opinion, terrible object. So they was just trying to experiment and see if there's another way to do things. And particularly at that time, there were things like McSweeney's and things outside of architecture that were really investigating in a time when there was such a flourish of digital work. There were other venues that were kind of investigating in a real materiality and the kind of return and devotion to print that I think we both found super exciting. So.
Just to finish on what you were saying, Mark. You're right about the quality of the object of the American magazine, but I don't think it's limited to the architecture magazine. I think it's American magazines in general, the paper, the attitude about advertising, et cetera, and versus content. That's why we're seeing such a crisis, I think, in so many American magazines today. From Time and Newsweek to everything else. It's not just that the web is so seductive, because if the object were really that great, the web wouldn't be that seductive. An interesting, I don't know if you've seen the new Avatari that has just been sort of reformatted and reorganized editorially out of Italy, but it's really surprising. I was quite taken with it. I just got it last week. They're actually organizing it around words. So they pick words and then they build editorial sections around these terms. And the words would seem to have no relationship, but the way they, at least this first issue, I think it worked pretty well. It's interesting. And I mean, it's a very different kind of magazine than we're talking about here. It's possible, in other words, it's possible to do the seductive object. It's about architecture and design. The Italians have been doing it better than the Americans for a long time, but maybe the people up here have been learning something from that as well. So from these brief comments from each of these groups of editors and writers, I noticed some terms. I mean, I'm in publishing because I love words and sentences, and architecture happens to be a great subject about which to write words and sentences. So I noted down some words. The two things that I thought were really interesting, Ryan, you were saying, from representing another pamphlet team, and maybe somebody else on your team should address this, is that you use the word conversation, which sounds very much like a project that was started for yourselves, and you didn't care at all if there was an audience initially, and maybe after you get it going, the audience starts to become something you're more aware of. So it's a very different attitude than Clog, for example. But the thing that I thought was quite interesting is you called it perversely anachronistic. Did I write that down right?
That's right.
Anachronistic. Anachronistic. Can't write my own writing. I want to know why it was perverse. What in your mind is perverse about it? Is it perverse as opposed to radical or not radical or ideological or not ideological? Because you didn't say any of those terms. So what is perversity?
Right. I mean, I think the project kind of came out of a lot of different areas. I think it wasn't a pure reaction to what was happening online. I think we were kind of very conscious. I think all of us kind of share, we're all from a generation that grew up, with digital media. So we weren't kind of taking a kind of counter position to that, but we thought that there was something to do with speed and kind of limits. There's something I think that happens on the web which has no kind of end game. There's this kind of continuation of information, and I think part of the format of pamphlet, I think we actually really like the kind of rules of the game that we set, which have to do with really kind of, I wouldn't say constraints that don't really tie people down, but I think allow certain kinds of freedoms to exist. So I think our format is, some people might say, is very rigid, but we think that in a similar way to what's happened with certain phenomena like Twitter, where people have actually had to find new ways to write you know, because there are these limitations. We actually found that kind of fascinating. So we were actually kind of like rethink that through a kind of printed form. So I mean, I think the question of limits is kind of interesting in print today, because you could argue that online there are no limits. You know, and it's just the kind of, I think it's a question of speed, and we're kind of interested in taking that very directly.
So that's two people who are interested in slowing down speed. See, I find this fascinating because log, which is 9 years old, started, I'm not the digital generation clearly, started to slow things down. And it's fascinating to me that you're all, I'm assuming Pigeon is the same in a certain way, by going to print, interested in slowing things down. You're not? You're interested in speeding it up?
Well, again, I think it's like a good, the more I sit here, the more I realize like how different our contexts were. I mean, just 6 years ago, but also like, again, being an institution versus, I mean, like another pamphlet logic of this quick essay that anyone can kind of like write this manageable chunk of text, and you guys have a similar constraint, I think is like, it makes a lot of sense for people who are like out in the world doing other things. And sort of a different thing about Pigeon is that we have the luxury, we're basically in a context where we're taking 2 or 3 or however many years of our lives to like think and hang out and not be in that environment. Which has advantages and disadvantages. So, I mean, for sure, like the format is a lot, it embraces longer form explorations a lot more. But yeah, I mean, we definitely at the time, like getting it out once a semester felt like really fast. I think. And it was for us a lot more about like getting things out, like what happened that semester, and the fact that we were like producing it on the side as graduate students who were super busy, like that was about the best we could do. And so we actually felt like it was about trying to get out there quickly, but have this physical object that I think maybe then similar to what you guys are kind of talking about, that I know we talked in the beginning about being able to see the kind of build up over time of like how things had changed, and that there was like a thing there that was this record that kind of had this feeling of being like a thing you could pull off the shelf, but that each individual thing was relatively succinct and of its time, and that could really change moving forward.
It feels quick, but it's not.
Yeah.
I mean, 2 a year,
No,
it's
it's not.
not.
It's
It's
not.
not. It's just how it feels. And
Yeah.
I think having another pamphlet model, we're saying, you know, we're all busy, so we're going to do 300 words,
Right.
makes a lot of sense. But
I just said the goal was definitely not to slow things down. Yeah,
no,
that was the best
no,
we
what?
could do.
That's not the goal. No, your goal was complete. We're going to get to you guys. You're jumping ahead of the line. Stop. Just because you're older and more like the bullies, okay? So, and it had the institutional clout. See, we're going to have to get to that. So, clump. So the two terms that I wrote down that fascinated me was this repeated use of the idea of doing something holistic. I'd like you to explain a little more what you mean by that, because I'm not sure that's possible. And second was the use of the word brand. And that sounds like, boy, you guys are out to take over architectural record. So what's the motivation behind these two terms that almost seem like, well, maybe they do go together? Can you talk a little bit about that?
You said holistic first.
It's your fault. It is my
Put it out
fault.
there.
Yeah, the idea is to take the time and to have an in-depth conversation about one topic. And every one topic has many subtopics. And we, even in editing and collecting these pieces, take our time to consider what topics perhaps we're missing after the open submissions, to make sure that we have as many different facets presented as we can think of and as we think are important to this conversation. And as what Kyle said is that it doesn't limit itself to just the publication that we end up putting out. These things continue, or hopefully continue beyond the actual publication. That's why we like these events, because we can discuss the topics even more in depth, and we'll meet people who have different points of view that we maybe weren't able to include, but that are important parts of the one subject. And if we keep doing this over time, I think we aim to touch on these subjects that are relevant and get them out into the discussion.
But I like what you said about sort of something that's of the time, like it marks something of the time. And I think that's all that we're trying to do too, is capture something of the time. But you know, topics that we really do want to see explored. I mean, a lot of journals actually do, they capture topics in some way. But there is no finite message to the end of our issues. I mean, it really does explore, you know, and that's, I think a lot of journals do the same thing. I mean, all of us here do that. Yeah, that's why I like about yours. It's sort of like just a blown out exploration.
But just for the purpose of today's conversation, I'm curious, and you said that you think holistic is, or achieving a kind of holistic approach, right, is impossible. Why?
Why?
Well, yeah, I'm just curious. I'll make sure we're answering the question.
Everything's always evolving.
Right.
So
right.
you can never
So it's never
figure
frozen.
put the lid on anything.
Yeah, so that's
so
what-
the word sort
That's
of,
good.
Yeah, I mean,
especially in a periodical, which is
not sure.
periodicity, right?
But part of it is too is that it's kind of a reaction against architects always talking to other architects and forgetting that there's clients, contractors, users, graphic designers, there's like all these other people in the world. So when we say holistically too, we're trying to bring in some of those other people to the discussion because they have unique points of view. So it's not just all architects, but we go out of our way to try to bring in people who don't have the typical architectural point of view, I guess.
Okay, so
And that may tie into the second question. Are we going to get
yeah,
to the
brand. I don't
Yeah,
want
I
you to
mean-
get away without talking about
No,
it.
no, no. I mean, I think that's we've been very deliberate about that, right? And I think it shows obviously in the design and the way we presented it and everything else. And for us, it's another tool, right? And that's how, I mean, we would love it if, and I mean, I kind of said it as an aside, but I mean it when the idea of this being kind of, in a way, I know it's almost claiming too much, but a gateway drug to architecture, that, you know, that for us, we really do believe that it's very important to create a conversation within architecture and to talk to each other, but also a lot of the major issues that make architecture suck right now, and but have always made it suck historically too, right? And just things always suck, right? But the only way you're ever going to tackle that, right? If you can engage everybody else, right? And engage people outside of architecture, because architecture is much more than architects. And for us, the choice of topics is one way towards that, right? The idea of encouraging as many people as possible to contribute to it, whether they be architects, designers, just concerned citizens. And also for us, creating a brand is a tool towards that too, because one great thing that we saw once was, in St. Mark's books, there were a bunch of kids sitting there reading Big cover to cover on the floor, and I don't know if they knew anything about Big, they were a bunch of high school kids, they might have known it, but you know, we can create enough interest that people see it, they see the C, they see the brand, and they say, oh, this is something interesting, I'm going to pick it up and read about it. And then they end up learning about architecture and coming away with an opinion about an issue that actually is incredibly important today in architecture, then we've accomplished something.
So are you saying like the first two issues are tied to Big and Apple?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, your logo merges with Apple in the second issue, right? You know, you're saying you're trying to like divorce brand from content on the cover somehow. But is that sort of using these corporations as like a leg up to interest people in architecture somehow, or
Sure.
That's
Sure, why not?
non-corporate?
Yeah, that's the raddest thing. Is I think like it was designed for that in a way, but also like kind of one of the raddest things that happened were people that were emailing us saying, "Hey, we got this, we got Apple, but it's all about architecture." It's like, well, yeah, that's what it is, and so read it, you know, have an opinion about it, and it was kind of deliberate in that way, you know. There's no building on the cover. The cover for Data Space, for instance, is a photo of a cloud, because that's how a lot of people envision the cloud. They think that information really travels through the air, that it doesn't live in buildings like it does.
Okay, so I think we're raising some interesting issues here we all talk about, but I have to throw at least a couple words at the pigeons here. You said two things. that I think are provocative that I'd like you to elaborate a little more on. One is the use of the word stories, which is very different from conversation, and well, they're calling it accessible dialogue. It's one of the things they talked about. And institutional privilege.
Right.
And in particular, I would ask you, not that it's necessary to do this, but is it possible when you're doing a publication within an institution to bite the hand that feeds you? I think that's a question that has to be put on the table so that we know where this journal's coming from.
Okay.
Okay? So stories and institutional privilege.
You were the one you mentioned.
Yeah.
Are they fairy tales? Are they, stories?
I guess I didn't think about it too much. I guess it was because of the nature of a few pieces that I've worked on in the last couple issues. But I think it comes back to this question of audience, and whereas there might be this sort of attempt, or whatever you want to call it, to engage, certainly the bombastic calling of it, to engage outside. I think for me, Pigeon is about the stories that we tell ourselves, and then about architecture and trying to make sense of architecture, and the audience perhaps isn't so clear, perhaps we talked about this, that we're creating an audience through those ideas. And the other thing I would say, just to jump ahead a little bit in transition, is that certainly the sort of circumstances are very different for the other two and ours, but I think the shortness is something that we have no stake in, and I would suggest maybe just listening and thinking right now that that shortness has something to do with the logic of consumption, which we either luckily or unluckily are allowed to resist.
You mean shortness as in brevity?
As in brevity, as in this is something that I can swallow.
Or for use. So the institutional thing, I mean, yeah, I think we were, I mean, in a way I would say, yeah, we were kind of allowed to bite the hand that fed us to a degree. There are certainly some things, I'm thinking of Pigeon 2, where we published that thing about Rafi that was kind of critiquing, this is a studio, right? About the Iraq embassies. Yeah, I mean, we certainly published some things even in the first two that were kind of critiques of things going on in studio, or, and again, it was really, I mean, it was pretty unique opportunity that Stan essentially gave us not that much of a budget, but a budget, and then like really left us alone. And never asked to see what was in it, and even I remember, I think we showed on those slides these like bug images, and it's always a good story that like the first time we went down to pitch this thing to him, basically we just had a stack of papers, and we were like, we really don't want it to be about promoting the school, like these other things that are out there, and we just kind of want it to be like whatever people are doing. And Stan's like flipping through this thing, and he sort of stops on these pictures of these bugs, and he's like, yeah, the bugs. I mean, this is really great. Like, this is so much more interesting than anything. And so we were like, oh, cool, he totally gets it. So he was like really on board from the beginning to kind of let us just it be whatever people were doing at the time. And again, because of all that, we didn't really have to have, I think the big advantage too, besides the fact that we could like call people up on the phone and like get image permissions for a lot cheaper, probably than we normally would. Because, it was also like we weren't trying to make any money, but it was that we did have, the cohesiveness came by everything that was in this somehow has something to do with this institution. But it didn't have to be anything really other than that. And so it allowed an incredible amount of diversity in topics and things that were explored and perspectives on in and around architecture that happened and things that weren't necessarily architectural that happened in that issue or across the
I mean, I think it also, we had the privilege of doing a kind of reverse, or a non-typical editorial process, right? Because we were kind of experimenting with the counter to having we saw very much that Cloud does, or many others, having a thematic name it, or Cabinet, or whatever magazine. And kind of, revolving everything around that. And we got a lot of push, and we had sort of the opportunity to experiment with something else. Because we had this kind of, this bulk of material there that we kind of ended up editing and finding and selecting and choosing. It's not like I can't speak for what's going on today, but we had too much stuff, and we were able to then pick and choose and kind of create our own thematic through that. And some of it was clearer than others, and some of it was kind of a mishmash. And I think, in my feeling, that was actually really successful and one of the more interesting things about that process. But we also got a lot of pushback on that, and there are other professors or students who I know were that are not into that. And I think later issues of Pigeon have had kind of thematic themes that go through. But for me, I think that was still one of the more interesting experiments and opportunities. And I think that came through both in design and the content. I like things like Us Weekly, and I like Blog or October. I got really fed up with having a magazine that really is sort of only the long form or only one short form. But actually, there's in a time when there's particularly something like the web. The lesson of the web for me is not about time, but about this kind of this multiple interdisciplinarity and graphic and written content coming together. Much more interesting, personally for me than the kind of time-based. I mean, I totally get the value of Twitter and the other kind of more, time-based limits of things. But the lesson for me from the web, which I feel like kind of came through in Pigeon, was actually more about kind of content, written and graphic, actually, high and low kind of coexisting at the same time in the same kind of plane. And I think that it still actually, many different editors, many generations later, it still has a lot of that feeling. I mean, it allowed sort of like bugs and really kind of PhD and scholarly essays to coexist, which I think was kind of interesting.
This idea of content, I think, is a good way to lead into a brief discussion about editing, and then I'd like to open it up to the audience, see what comments they might have, and there may be some other publications represented out here that aren't at the table as well, or publications in the making. I mean, one of the things I've always done as an editor is encourage young people to continue to produce magazines, to produce publications. So there may be some of you out there that we want to hear from or who want to interrogate this group. So I wanted to speak about this idea of editing, about content, about selecting content. I mean, you obviously have a rich trove being in the institutional setting and all this work being produced around you to choose from. But I'm interested in another pamphlet's idea, because when you call it a conversation, it almost sounds casual to the outsider, and it doesn't sound so much like editing. And then Sarah used the word editing plus curating, and there's been such emphasis on this, so much discussion about curating, that curating's been sort of taking over our lives. And I've been pushing back, and I've been saying, no, editing is important, and it's not the same thing as curating. So I'd like to sort of put that out on the table and see if we can have a little discussion, just free for all. But I would ask you guys to just answer first, because I'm interested in, do you think of yourselves as editors or writers or creators or curators or just conversationalists? I'd like to know where you are on that.
Yep. Let's talk around it. I think we may have a couple different takes on it, actually. It'd be interesting to see, because we've had a lot of internal debates, actually, about sort of what an editor is, what the role of editing is in this little sort of thing that we've kicked off and tried to get going. I mean, the way I described it at the beginning as a sort of setting of the table, one of the main ambitions for us is to actually really sort of dig deep into a topic that we think is interesting, and then think really hard about who else we want to bring into that conversation and involve in that. And we sort of see that as one of the main roles that we have as editors. I'm not sure you could call that an editor, but as the sort of protagonist of the issue. And then we sort of set this thing in motion, and then the question that we've had internally all along is, how much do we fear in this like experiment as it's playing out, as people are sending stuff in. And then in the issue number 3 that we just had, we actually had a sort of roundtable discussion that we sort of let unfurl as well, and we try to figure out how much to edit stuff of that out, or to sort of let the some of the weird contrasts and juxtapositions that just started emerging actually reveal those, even if they didn't totally make sense or add up to something conclusive.
Yeah, I mean, I think.
Does editing feel like interference to you?
Well, I think we pick people that we sort of trust. I mean, people that we like in some way. We want to hear what they have to say. I mean, that's what the conversation is. It's like we pick the topics we've done so far: legibility, repetition, and the future. So it's not, things that maybe everyone has an instant opinion on, but you have a sort of take on it. So when we invite the people that we invite, they come from different aspects of people we know, people we tangentially know, people we may be interested in that we don't know. And when they submit, we get this sort of wide variety of takes on that. Some of them are completely nonsensical and don't make, they don't add up.
Or they add up in unexpected ways.
Right, exactly. And there's always this overlap that happens when you get someone you wouldn't expect kind of matching up with someone else. And that, this speaks, there's one other thing that, we briefly covered it, but, we don't actually credit each piece in the pamphlet. If you look through, they're not labeled. The names are all in the back, contributors are in the back. But we sort of take the names off of the actual individual pieces to create a collective.
Major act of interference. Why do you do that?
We do that because we believe in sort of the sort of level playing field and judging an idea based on its own merits. So when you read these pieces and you see who wrote in the back, you're kind of guessing.
That's a very strong ideological statement.
It is. You're right. But I didn't say it wasn't. That's why I'm bringing it up. But we think that actually, it creates an interesting tension inside the publication and inside the reader as well. You're trying to kind of figure out who said what, and it takes the pressure off of the people.
It might be a good way to get people to actually read it, figure out.
Well, it's not meant as a game, but
But it's part of the game.
but if you have someone who's sort of well established in the architectural discourse writing, alongside someone who may be a student or someone who may be not an architect, suddenly all of their ideas are kind of equal, and you judge them based on their strengths. And most people actually guess wrong. The people that you would normally assign a weight to, like, oh, well, Stan Allen wrote that's a good idea, right? Or that's an interesting idea. Well, maybe people thought Stan wrote a different piece. So suddenly you're weighing the ideas. It's not a sort of meritocracy anymore. It's sort of it's really kind of a blind conversation in some ways. You're right. I mean, it's ideological, but we think it's produced some unexpected results even within our readership.
Just to kind of touch on that as well. I think that the question of authorship is really important. And I think part of the experiment is just kind of playing a little bit with the limits, and trying to see, at first I think we were very hesitant about really going forward with this idea, because we weren't sure kind of like what the reaction would be from people who would submit. But I guess we've been pleasantly surprised. We've been reaching out to people, and everybody's very kind of enthusiastic about it, and they kind of have to buy into the concept. I think there's I think the idea of, and Ryan kind of touched on it, but the collective, there's this kind of temporary moment where people kind of come together, and they may know each other, they may not, but they come together, and there's a kind of common thing that's produced. The continuation of that really is this kind of postscript that we're working on. I don't think it's kind of perfected, but we're trying to figure out a way to extend the conversation beyond the submission. So this kind of roundtable discussion, which we actually have through email, because a few of these people are kind of in the same city, is one way of then kind of going back and really then actually having a conversation. So it's open, we kind of open it up for a couple days, and people respond, and then we end up publishing those. So.
Kyle, do you think of the themes that you choose as an act of editing or curating, or all of the above, or none of the above?
Yeah, we spend, months debating and arguing amongst ourselves about what we should talk about, what our next topic should be. But I think the themes for us are, because we inherently don't choose themes like legibility, or we have a theme as opposed to pigeon. So, but our themes are very specific, and for us, that's just a matter of actually being able to advance the dialogue on that topic. If we all sit around and talk about black tablecloths, we'd probably, at the end of the day, know a lot about black tablecloths, but a lot of kind of open-ended topics, anybody can talk about them, but at the end of the day, in my opinion, it doesn't advance the topic, the thinking about that topic. So that's
Well,
why.
you have to be careful with the topic. Black tablecloths aren't so interesting.
Sure.
I mean, look.
Yeah.
But actually, just to add to that, I think that we think like what another pamphlet's doing with their relationship to the author is really fascinating, right? And for us, we really wouldn't be able to do that because part of it ties into the way we pick our topics too. Is that at least up until now, this could all change. I mean, this could all blow up and change, and who knows when. But for up until now, we've really strived to pick up topics that everyone is weighing in on right now online, but oftentimes pretty haphazardly and without accountability. So for example, with Apple, as soon as the headquarters went public, you saw just a million posts online, which were just, raving and some were, fully praising, but because of the format through which a lot of the dialogue was taking place, which was chat boards on like Art Daily and other blogs, that there was a lack of accountability that kind of putting something down on a page and freezing it and putting your name next to it forces you to take. And we're very interested in that, and I think that ties into something that is also why we're interested in the idea of print as well. Obviously, there's ways to have that kind of accountability when you're working online, but we thought the print format really lends itself to that. And that changes the way people say things and what they say, and we think that's valuable. And we've certainly had contributions from people who are well-known who have actually wanted to have their name published anonymously, and they've argued that that's how they want to do it, they want to put it out there, and we ultimately have had to say no and have had to reject the pieces as a result. So that's just a kind of core belief that we have, but that also ties into our choice of topics and what we're trying to do. So.
That technique allowed you to publish things that you maybe not would have been able to publish otherwise?
It's interesting. I think one of the...
Did you hear the question?
One of the... I think one of the sources of inspiration or kind of things that we were kind of reacting to was, a lot of things that you see on blogs has the kind of blog post, and then you have the kind of comment section. And the fact that you can anonymize your comment was something that we thought was just, there was a sense of liberation there that we found, kind of interesting. And if there was a way to actually capitalize on that or kind of take that and use that as a kind of way of working, basically. So I don't know, we've kind of been testing that.
Doesn't that sort of suggest that everyone knows each other? I mean, isn't it sort of like you just had 20, 15, 10 people that no one's ever heard of, it would be meaningless. And so it's sort of like a dinner party where you sit down and everyone sort of has a bag of it or whatever. And isn't that like a certain kind of discourse where you're sort of assuming a certain kind of conversation through that technique? Right.
Yeah, to some degree. I mean, I think it's also that we've sort of, we only send it out to a couple hundred people right now. We know most of them, or we're working within a certain sort of field of familiarity to begin with, and so we're actually trying to cut against that a little bit. And it's also a little bit of response to, architecture is a relatively small discipline. We sort of all, a lot of the same writers show up over and over and over again, and so trying to navigate in some new way through that.
That's one way to fool your readers then, that you have new people because they're on signs. Even though the same people are in Clog or in Pigeon or in Log, right? So I think that's interesting. I have to throw in about Log because I hear so many things going on here that also occur in Log, which is this whole thing about mixing the known and the unknown. But how do you send your mother your article when your name's not on it? Because a lot of mothers would say, you did this, where's your name? Right? So, there is that problem, right?
My mother's actually guessed each time the 3 pieces that I wrote. So.
Oh, so that's one way to force her to read the whole thing. But there is this the whole effort, at least in log, is that probably is with everything at the table, to constantly introduce new voices to the ongoing discussion about architecture. And that I have always felt personally, as an editor, that new voices are taken seriously if they're alongside voices we already take seriously or already laugh at or whatever. But it gives you some context that, oh, look, this is next to so-and-so. This must be something I should read. And so they actually skip the person they already are to read the new person because they don't know who it is. So that I think it can work in both ways. I think what you're doing is really interesting. And there's clearly an ideology that underpins it. That is something worth thinking about. Any last comment about content editing here? Or do you think we covered it?
I think we mostly covered it. I mean, I guess I would just add one thing that's basically where the name of the magazine comes from.
Yeah, where does this come
from? We had a lot of ideas about what the name could be, but I actually think it's one of the things we got really right with the name. And we were basically like looking at, what we liked is the overlap between the kind of two potential meanings of the idea of like a carrier pigeon that was like taking a message out from this lost place in the middle of New Jersey to maybe some other people. And the other, yeah, but it's kind of hard to find. Anyway, and the other thing was, then what the actual spelling of it refers to is the idea of an invented language between cultures that come together that don't speak each other's language and have to find a way to communicate.
Pidgin English.
Right, or yeah, pidgin anything. I mean that's yeah. So that was really, I think when we got that double meaning, we got really excited because that was sort of the goal. Was that again, we had this group of people we knew we were pulling from, and what we were really interested in is the fact that we're all here finding ourselves in architecture school, but we had a lot of different ways that we got there. So finding a way to communicate with each other, and I think then somehow the editorial position was to take that and try to just kind of adjust the content to give it a little bit of shape. I mean, like what order things went in and kind of how, what pieces we picked and didn't, that we would actually see like, oh, a lot of people are talking about this right now. And so we didn't have to like set a theme. It was like the theme, I would argue that a lot of at least a couple of pieces that we did have a theme to them, but it's not stated. But it came from us kind of seeing the content and seeing a shape emerge and beginning to cultivate that into something.
And I think that was also a huge learning process for us. Yeah. I mean, when we initially, our first call for submissions was, the original idea was actually a super open format that everybody could be in it, that we kind of delivered a template that everybody would design themselves. Really it was the most open source thing possible. And I think we very quickly learned that one of the greatest lessons is like the more editing that we could do, the better. And you see a big gap from 1 to 2 and from 2 to 3. And I'm sure that has continued on. 2 to 3, our writing, the editing of the writing piece, the written piece got much better. And I think all of my, at least for me, I don't know, Brian, but all my hesitancy of early on about having a real strong voice in it and editing kind of quickly went away as we really got into the nuts and bolts of making this thing and trying to craft something good. So that was a lesson. It was very, as you said earlier, it was absolutely personal. That was a real lesson.
The trick was to kind of invert it, where the themes or the ideas, we kind of got to discover them as the content came in, and that was really the goal. Like, what is the conversation that's going on?
I hate to tell you, but you're not the first person to discover.
Oh yeah. But it was nice for us. No one's ever done that before?
At this table? I'd like to open it up. We can't see you very well out there. Are there some questions in the audience? Comments? Or are you're the silent reading types? No? Please.
I want to know how you're going to deal with the fights and the conflicts and all that it's about open source. How do you decide what phase one's going to go?
Everybody hear that? She wanted to know how you settle conflicts between yourselves as teams. Let's start with that really big team.
Very scientific process.
Arm wrestling.
Brute strength. I mean, yes, it starts with the Google Doc that we have. I mean, to be honest, actually, yeah, we duke it out internally, right? And
Talk about it
and
for hours.
there's a lot of disagreement, and then we come to agreement somehow, which usually involves a majority vote. But just to add on to something, I guess there's one thing I was thinking of, and Julie did mention curation. I think that there's a connotation that there's a very negative connotation I have for curation too. I think it is overused, and it's something that I think that we certainly do see that when it comes, we strive when we address the topic for it to be. As we're taking all these disparate pieces, we try to kind of cobble together, even though it might not be explicit, a narrative, and to let themes and intentionally kind of have a dialogue emerge from it. And that's what we consider to be the curatorial aspect of it. When it comes to the editing, we do certainly edit, and we've got, it's something we're still learning ourselves, because none of us obviously are professional editors. And we're very much learning as we go along, and this ties into the kind of debates we have about pieces that we accept, is that one thing we are committed to is that if we get a piece that we think expresses a truly interesting idea, a truly unique point, whether it be a graphic piece, a written piece, or a combination, and it is a total mess, and if we think there's a real kernel of an idea there, we're willing to put in the time and the effort, and it's thankless and it takes a lot of time, but to actually craft it into something that we feel like can be presented. And we don't know if that's too heavy-handed or not. So far, authors we've done that with have only been happy that we've done it, and no one has complained we've changed their pieces too much. But we do think that putting in the time to do that, even though obviously we get no credit for it, is worth it, because part of what we're trying to do is to give people who don't necessarily see themselves as writers or critics, or theorists, to give them a forum through which to make an argument, to make a point. I think that a lot of people, particularly practitioners and various other fields, do have very strong points to make, and we want to create a place for them to do that. And we do edit, and that's where we see a lot of our editing work going into that effort, which probably nobody notices, but maybe they do.
Anybody else want to weigh in on how you settle conflict? You guys never have a conflict, I can tell.
It's a dinner party.
These editors that pitch it just keep changing all the time, so they have no opportunity to fight. Any other comments, questions? Oh, good.
Yeah. I have a question about circulation, and this is, with blogs, you can have 1 million readers, 2 million readers, you never really have to make a decision on how many people you're going to reach. But with print, you've done this whole thing, and you're happy with what you've created, and you have to click that number of, I'm going to print X many issues. I'm just wondering what the number is for each publication and what that sort of says, if world domination is the goal, or just a conversational friends.
Start and go around. Well, they said 200. Is it really? You
We
print
said
more than
about
that.
400.
400. Oh, they doubled it.
But it's grown. We put stamps on them and sent them in the mail. And
So
sort of-
how many do you print? I don't care how many readers you have. How many do you print?
well, we print them on copy machines,
So
so
we keep adding.
continue to print.
So you can add as you
People
can
request.
replenish the
Yes,
supply.
yes. Well, and every time we do, we sort of have to make them and send them out.
We've had a bit of a scale challenge,
Yeah.
because I think we started really small. I mean, again, it was this kind of the immediate network, and then it's just the second ring and the third ring. It's basically just kind of expanded, and I think with this Arcazine show and a couple, there's kind of interest abroad, and I think we're trying to find ways now to reach a larger audience, and it's actually kind of having a little bit of feedback on the publication itself, because I think we're trying to find ways, again, with the kind of postscript thing where we want to continue this dialogue. So I think there's a little bit of kind of feedback. How do other people get interested in it as well, and not just us? So it's kind of beyond our initial kind of fascination with just this topic. So,
but it does raise a super interesting question. And we've had a lot of internal conversations about this, about what exactly are our motivations, and is it actually important to keep growing and growing and growing, or like how does that actually change what our actual experience is with it? Would it be the same if we just continued to have 200 or 300 that we printed each time? I'm not sure we've totally landed anywhere, except that it's hard to say no when people ask to read something that you've made and to see something that you've made, so you just want to keep finding ways of getting there.
Why would you want to say no, other than the physical labor of having to produce it? Or is that the problem?
That's the problem,
It's
actually.
a cost issue, too.
It's a cost of time.
Yeah, we're Excel
no, of course.
press
Let's bring it up. I'm just saying,
everybody.
there's real limitations. with,
Yeah,
you know,
if you can't find money, don't do this. How many pigeons do you print? 1,000? And you?
We started off at 1,000. Now we're up to 3,500.
3,500? That's rapid fire. That's very quick. Branding works, guys. Okay, so is there another question over here? Yeah.
I just want to ask about completion of my, I mean, it's kind of on the answer where I see the future of both this journal. Say if we talk about blogs for a second, these blogs they start out as, you know, they selected the ones that they want to talk about, now they're being submissions, and there's no filtration system for these blogs that kind of turning to shit in a way. So how do you guys see yourselves growing in a positive way? So say for a blog they have these discussions and how do you see yourself guys going in the future of like how things are going to expand, like whether is it just journal or I don't know especially with what else
Well, for me, I think, well, for all of us anyways, I think the most exciting thing about, for me, the exciting thing about CLOG or any of these journals is the discussions and the conversations that happen. And for us, I think it's about what happens in person. Like right now, I mean, the issues get out because 9 people do duke it out, but it's not really duking it out. It's, we want to actually promote some idea and have a conversation, and it's exciting for us because we're all the same in a lot of ways, but we're pretty much polar opposites in a lot of ways too. So it's exciting to, at the end of the day, come to a conclusion about something that you both love and care about. So it's however we can do that. I mean, if it's, I mean, I love going to, there's Badoon magazine, the Middle Eastern Arts magazine. They have an amazing storefront, and it's a great place to gather. I mean, ... magazine have always had a really good storefront on the Lower East Side, and I remember going 3 years ago to the opening of an issue where there was 13 people and they were serving tea, and the editors in London were on Skype and they were wasted and they were talking about their issue, and there was a discussion happening between me and somebody in London, and we were talking about the same things. So I would like for it to happen in person more, and I think the print thing as an object is always a really good starting point to see where it goes from there. But
There's actually another magazine that I'm sure we're all familiar with, but San Rocco, which I find has a very interesting kind of plan and end. You know, the fact that they kind of predetermine, you know, and however many issues they want to have. I don't know if it's 15, 20 issues. But I think there's a kind of life and death to a lot of these publications, and I think knowing, you know, kind of being really honest about that, you know, and kind of understanding what that means, you know, putting something to rest after.
No, I think that's absolutely true, because I get asked that now. Now the blog is 9 years old, people are saying to me, how much longer are you going to do this? And it's not people like you guys who maybe would like me off the stage. It's longtime readers who are like, you know, all magazines have their lifespan. They should only exist for so long, like Assemblage only existed for so long, and some people think maybe October should have stopped a while ago, but it hasn't. And why does something stop when it stops? And at Pigeon, now you've got an institutional brand, so to speak, does it ever stop? Just because you have another flow of students coming?
I think it's more of a ritual.
A ritual?
Oh, fair. In the institutional setting, because there's constant renewal. And I think that's like the difference between something that's someone's project and something that's an institution. Right? Like something that's someone's project has a life and a death because the person has a life and a death.
Well, it's a little, compared to perspective,
Yeah, but except the perspective has had, you know, several lives, and something things can take on one. I mean, that's kind of, can't set out to do that, but it might happen.
Anybody else? You guys all, oh, one person?
Just, can you comment about how the keywords you entered as well as the web? Which your content there?
video, I think, in some way. I would like to see video comments. Whereas, like, I think the contributor always answers a topic that we pick. And, like, for instance, of Big, they comment on Big, and then we gave Bjork the opportunity to actually comment on that. And then there was an opportunity to comment on that in public. But it would be awesome to be able to see that continue and continue and continue. So online is probably the best opportunity for that. So whether it's opportunities for anybody else to comment on the actual commentary in the issue, I think video would be kind of one of the most exciting ways to do that. Actually putting a face to thing, something while you can online. But.
Yeah?
I was wondering if each team could sort of address the issue of their production. Why did you choose the format you did, and how does it relate to the content?
Well, from the Pigeon side, the format was was a big battle for us and really critical. We talked about all different formats from tabloid to you name it, and we ended up with this. And actually, it's too much discussion, particularly between Brian and I. Like, you know, we had talked about it changing and not. And we go back and forth on this. I'm actually really happy that it has stayed this way. I think Brian is curious that it hasn't gotten tested in other sizes and things. But the original reason why this is because it's a complete bizarre format. It's something that we were really trying to get out of a format that somebody already had something formatted for. It's not a format that anybody has anything ready for in this size. It's a format that you have to kind of rethink and reformat your work, whether it's written or more importantly graphic in the case of this kind of thing. That it really to counter the kind of typical format, a portfolio format that happens where people are plugging in the same old PowerPoint or poster board presentation that you might have at school, or you name it, 8.5 by 11 or 11 by 17. It was precisely because this is such a weird size that it takes some thought to kind of rejig it and think about how it would work in here. So you have to spend some time that it was not going to be just a kind of a repackaging or something. I think that was really critical. And the other thing is that it had to do with its kind of objecthood of being small and an object that we could get a kind of depth and thickness to it. I mean, we studied a lot the kind of thickness that happens. You know, it's remained 256 pages almost entirely. There's one issue, I don't know about the later ones, but they're always been pretty much the same. So there was a lot of thought given to the proportions, the feel of it, that it's small enough that you could take it on the subway and not be annoying, that it wasn't this kind of big tabloid. You know, all of that kind of design discussion that goes into that was really key for us. The paper, all of that.
Just what you just said there, though, suggests that you expected a very expanded readership, because to my knowledge, there's no subway in Princeton.
Yeah, from our initial description of it was always about a kind of broadcast.
He's so serious.
Ambition, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean our ambition was all about that kind of broadcast. Absolutely.
Yeah.
No question.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, we didn't really have a particular readership in mind, but it was like anyone that was outside of...
Anybody in the subway?
Yeah, anyone in, yeah. I think just to quickly follow up on that too, is that I think it's a really good point about the difference between print and the web, is that you can really use the form to like mess with and aggregate and clean things up relative to the content, which, you know, I think a lot of blogs tend to flatten things into a kind of known format, and I mean, everybody here, I think, is exploring, like...
Well, that's why this is a good question,
yeah.
Because these are all architects, and architects really sort of desire to make objects. And you've talked about the simplicity of your object, right? Do you have anything else you want to say about it?
I mean, I would just say one quick thing. I mean, the question of format, it's inherent in the name, and we chose pamphlet because it has, by definition, has no cover. It's more than 5 pages, but not over 48. It's kind of random definition of what a pamphlet is. But we like that there was a certain kind of curation, or almost like kind of editing that happened, because it's basically an 8.5 by 11 folded. So the amount of contributions are actually determined by the amount of folds that we can get from publication. So we basically get as many, I think we start with 9, but we've gone to 10 because we've had to add a page in the back. So, I mean, we've kind of broken the rules, but also worked within basically this incredibly reductive format. It's almost kind of, it has edited kind of itself almost.
But it's not meant to last forever either. I mean, the paper cover, you put it in your back pocket, you put it in your bag, it starts to fall apart. I mean, these ideas are kind of meant to be of that moment and kind of temporary, and 6 months from now, the thing may be tatters on your floor, and you can throw it out.
Anti-precious.
Yeah, anti-precious, definitely.
And then the only other thing to say is that we were really trying to think hard about lowering the barriers that would keep us from making this thing. So anything that sort of complicated or make it harder than it was, we were trying to sort of cut out of it so that, well, yeah, and the money issue. So, but really trying to strip it down to the very essential that we can still do what we're trying to do.
Blog? Format?
It's the same as this. It's 8.5 by 11 folded in half for the same kind of reason. It's portable and it just seems sort of obvious, and I had a reaction to the tabloids as well.
To do a perfect binding from the outset.
Oh,
Very
yeah.
different.
Yeah, I mean,
Why that?
to be honest, we actually started off
having more of an intent to do something kind of quick and print it out at work or something and staple it when no one was looking and distribute it to our friends. But it actually just kind of grew bigger than that, and we got to a point where it was like kind of on the edge between like we'd have to buy a bigger stapler or we'd have to like add a couple more contributions and go to perfect binding, and then we kind of decided that we liked the object. So
Yeah, I mean, it also comes down to, like, somebody talked about circulation in stores, and dealing with stores is a really fun thing to do, but it's a very tough thing to do, and most of the arguments are about consignment or not consignment, which that's another part of our whole thing, is that we're 100% against consignment for us, not in general, but for us, because when I have a conversation with the store and they say, well, we don't want to give you money unless we know it sells, we ask them to take the risk. We'll be in less stores, of course, but I'd rather them have accountability to put our journal on their shelves and have some sort of desire to actually sell it or interest in it to begin with. So so having it perfect bound and making it the most beautiful thing that we can, but also the most simple, is very important for us, because when it gets to them, I mean, what's exciting is that when people get the issue, a lot of people that got clog Apple, they would photograph it, really shittily on their Blackberries and then tweet it, because they were so obsessed with getting it in the matte glossing on the cover, which is, it's fine, but it's not something crazy. It's just simple and it's intentional.
And just to, in a very real way, I'll be very quick, but this is just, it just ties into, again, that we just want, it kind of adds to our communicative mission, right? That we would be very happy if it were, we want it in front of bookshelves, right? In front of bookstores, we want it in windows, and the format that we're doing, we're hoping will lead towards that, and it's, to a degree, has been very successful.
But does that mean that you chose this format thinking about the store window at the outset?
Yeah.
Okay.
We wanted something that would be, that we could make an argument, make it to the store.
You're right. If you're making a brand, you got to think about what it looks like in the window. I just want to add about log and the object of log, because Mark said McSweeney's earlier, is that log is the exact dimension of the original McSweeney's, the literary magazine, precisely because log wanted to be a literary magazine within architecture, about architecture, a magazine that resists the seductive power of the image, and therefore is very heavily text. Now, I saw one other question. Does that question still exist? And then I think we have to get this group to a drink. Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering, for each of you, what your avenues are to hear back, not just from people who are submitting, but from readers, and what avenues you have for that, and do you really care what your readers think?
Alex, do you care?
No.
No, that was a short answer. No feedback and don't care.
Again, that goes back to the institutional question.
Okay, no and no.
Because if we mess up, then the next group can atone for us.
For us, our feedback from our contributors is direct, and we email them and ask them to contribute. We just are in constant communication with them throughout the process.
Your readers.
From the readers, sorry. Okay, the readers also email us. We have like an online sort of business card website where we have our contact who's written, and they email us and request issues. We haven't really gotten a ton of.
No, and I mean, I think part of what we're doing is we're actually we're sending these ideas out into the world, and kind of because we want them to be out there in some way, we want somebody to hear it. I'm not sure we're following up and saying like, did you get what we sent you? Did you understand it? What did you think about it? I don't know. Some of that doesn't feel like something I'd be interested in.
Yeah, I'd like them to like it.
And could we ask it a different way, which is, I don't know if anybody out there has any critique about or would like to see something else on either of the three. I mean, I guess what worries me about, obviously I love each of these journals, and we're all kind of really, really into the format, but what worries me about it is it's also kind of a panel discussion about people who are all, in some way or another, invested in the same thing with no real critique of it. It's like we're all labradoodle breeders, and we're talking about how great a labradoodle is. It's like, if there are critiques out there, or just suggestions about things that you'd love to see, it'd be great to hear about it. I mean, particularly for me, it's about writing. I mean, since I've left Pigeon, or since just being an architect, and particularly in New York, it's like I don't see a lot of really great forum for cutting critique about or writing about architecture in a short form, not in a long PhD format. And I mean, that's one of the things that I find really exciting, for example, about the pamphlet in this whole issue of kind of slightly anonymous. And where I was getting at with my question is it could allow for somebody, kind of as a ghostwriter form, to be a little more cutting, or it could allow for people to do something that they wouldn't normally do. And I think it would be interesting to test that more, to see where those kind of things. But anyway, I don't know if anybody else has critique.
I'll tell you what, Mark, I think it's a really great point, but you promised to be finished half an hour ago. And so Mark is happy to stay and talk with me about that. I myself am going to go home and have some dinner. So I thank you all for organizing this, for being here. While we didn't get be critical of one another, I think we at least saw some real sharp, clear differences between the efforts that are being made here. And I hope all of you are readers of at least one, if not all, of these publications. Thank you for coming.
One last thing, sorry. You can join us all in the back for some wine afterwards if you want to discuss any of these topics further. And everybody, I think, except Pigeon, has stuff for sale. If you don't know them and you want to read about them.
We don't sell anything.